Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today I'll be discussing my first quarter grades for the San Jose Sharks. And as per usual, I do need to clarify that this is not a scale of who I believe is the best player and who I believe is the worst player on the San Jose Sharks. If that were the case, then Toffoli and Grundstrom having the same grade would be the equivalent of saying that they are at the same talent level, which is very far from the case. But instead, these are grades given to each individual player based on my reasonable preseason expectations for them coming into this season and whether or not they managed to over or underperform compared to that. And so all of these grades are in a vacuum and in no way related to what any other player may have received. The other thing to note here is that there is a minimum 10 game cutoff. Below that, it feels as though there's just not enough of a sample size to talk about. So for instance, there is no Klim Kostin here. He's only played 9 games. And more notably, there is no Timothy Liljegren here, who I believe has only played 7 games with the Sharks. There is one exception, however, to that. I will be discussing Macklin Celebrini in this video for the simple fact that he is an interesting player to talk about, being the future of the San Jose Sharks, even though he's only played 8 games, and so he will be taking the place of Danil Gushchin. Gushchin did barely meet that requirement. He has played 10 games, but since he's been with the San Jose Barracuda for these last couple of weeks, and I honestly don't foresee a call-up in the near future unless the Sharks get really hampered by injuries, it feels as though Celebrini is more relevant to talk about. We will also be heading in order of jersey numbers from lowest to highest, which means we are starting off with number 2 here, Will Smith. And Smith is one of the more difficult players to evaluate when it comes to everybody else almost on this team. You already kind of know what to expect because they have some NHL games under their belt, but Smith, it's not the case. He's coming straight out of college. Some people believed he could be a dark horse Calder candidate with 50 plus points. Others believed he'd be spending most of the season with the San Jose Barracuda. In this season thus far, Smith has started off very, very slow. The first 10 or so games that he played, which encompassed like the first 14 or so games of this quarter for the Sharks, there were constant discussions of sending him back down, or not even back down, but just generally down to the San Jose Barracuda because he really wasn't making much of an impact. He would maybe have an occasional okay game, but more often than not be more or less invisible on the ice. However, Smith has managed to turn things around recently. His last few games have been a good bit better, and in particular his last couple of games in which he has been placed with Macklin Celebrini, he has been significantly better and one of the better offensive talents on the San Jose Sharks. And so it has been this very quick turnaround for him, where in the earlier parts of the season I would have given him like a C-, maybe even slightly lower than that. But with the sudden change, now we're looking at a still not great grade, but a lot better of a C+, and this is one that is trending upwards. Then we get to number 3 here, Henry Thrun. Last season, Thrun had significant issues with maintaining a certain level of consistency. He could have a decent game and then the very next day end up just playing completely awful. And so coming into this year, while obviously you're hoping for some defensive improvements, what you're really expecting from him is just a higher level of consistency. At least if he's paired on the third pairing, that he can just be pretty good on a game-to-game basis. But we really haven't seen that from Thrun thus far this year. A lot of those times on those third pairings, he has still managed to struggle immensely. Yes, you could certainly say that he hasn't had the best partners. In the early parts of the season, it was Matt Benning, and recently it has been a lot of Jan Ruda. Neither of those two players have been even remotely decent this season, but even from an individual standpoint, I have not really appreciated Thrun's performances. There is one exception to that, however, which is the stretch of games in which Jake Wallman was injured. Thrun took up the mantle on the top pairing once Warsofsky woke up and realized that Ceci and Ferraro was an absolute disaster as a unit, and he started to look much better in that more expanded role, which created this weird situation with Thrun where when he played against tougher competition with more ice time, he looked better than when he was against weaker competition with less ice time. And so I can't necessarily give him a horrible grade because there was that stretch in which he was one of the more performing Sharks defensemen on the team, but he ends up still with a very middling grade of a C. Then we get to Cody Ceci. The expectations for him weren't really high coming into this season, even though he was a top 4 defenseman on the Edmonton Oilers last year, and that team made it all the way to Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals. It felt as though many people didn't really view Ceci as a very valuable defenseman, including the Oilers themselves, who ended up having to trade him to the Sharks in a cap dump type of situation. And I feel as though Ceci has kind of gotten the short end of the stick at times from people. Many people will say and lump him in with players like Ferraro Ferraro and Ruda, who have genuinely been very bad when talking about the Sharks' struggles defensively this season, but I actually think Ceci has been mostly rather okay. There was obviously a stretch of time where Ceci was really bad. In the latter half of that 9-game losing streak to start the season, Ceci was a big part for why the Sharks were losing those games. He was not even remotely good. And there are still the multiple egregious errors and just weird decision-making points that Ceci has had this season with just very standout mistakes. But more often than not, I think Ceci has kind of held the fort down at least decently well, especially in the position that he is in, being played as the top pairing defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. He's inserted into a role that he's not used to playing, and he's done a relatively admirable job compared to a lot of the other players who are playing outside of their own role and have been struggling considerably. And so while his grade is not fantastic because there have been obvious issues here, it's still pretty decent at a B-. Then we get to Nico Sturm. Not a ton to say here. He's pretty much found himself on the fourth line the entirety of this season. He has okay numbers in that role. 3 goals, 3 assists, 6 points. He's never really blown you away with, oh wow, what a great performance from Sturm outside of maybe the first couple of games of this season. But he also is pretty rarely ever like a massive liability on the ice. There were a few games this season where the fourth line wasn't great, but I wouldn't put too much fault on Sturm there. He's been I would say, a reasonable player for the Sharks this season, and so he ends up with a B-. Then we get to Luke Kunin. It's been a bit of a tale of 2 seasons for Luke Kunin. At the start, he was one of the more energized and really involved players on the San Jose Sharks during that 9-game losing streak. While you couldn't say he was one of the best, because obviously he doesn't have a ton of skill from a sort of talent perspective, but in terms of the effort that he was putting forward, you liked what you saw from Kunin. The problem is that once the Sharks actually have improved, Kunin has sort of gone the opposite direction, and he's not looking nearly as good. There were many games in which he was actually kind of bad, many games in which he was rather invisible, and while yesterday was a nice step back into the limelight for him with a good performance on that fourth line, including that goal, it felt as though that was the first time in a while where we've actually seen that from Kunin. So he has outperformed expectations in my eyes, but it felt as though he was on track for a better grade near the start of the season, and now near the end of this quarter, he ends up with the just alright C+. And we get to Fabian Zetterlund. Zetterlund's had an interesting season thus far because there have been multiple games where honestly he hasn't looked all that great. Definitely near the start, those first few games of the season, he was trying to find a spot in the Sharks lineup. At times he was paired with Will Smith, who really wasn't doing him many favors, but even Zetterlund himself wasn't looking that great. But what really jumps out on the score sheet here is that he has managed to keep up in terms of points. 7 goals, 7 assists, 14 points in 20 games. That's rather good. That's a 56-point pace over a full season. But what really stands out is his plus-minus. Many people dismiss this as an irrelevant stat these days, and more often than not, you could certainly make that argument. But what it is, when it's this different from the rest of the team, that really leaves a mark. So Fabian Zetterlund is the only positive forward on the San Jose Sharks. Every other forward that they have is in the negatives, not by a significant margin, but still there, except Zetterlund, who is a +7. That is an extreme difference. He's not just a +1, he's a +7. When Zetterlund is on the ice at even strength, the Sharks are winning the battles consistently, and you do have to give some credit there. So while there were many games, maybe not many, but a few games this season which Zetterlund didn't leave a massive impact, when he's on, he is absolutely on. He's been much better as of late, and so he gets a pretty good grade here of a B. And then we get to Alex Wennberg, number 21. He's been very calm, cool, and collected this season. There's not really a ton to love about Wennberg, but there's also really not anything to hate either. He's not exactly a Selke candidate, but he has brought the Sharks some decent defensive play. He has earned the trust of Ryan Warsofsky. He's not going to be lighting things up offensively, but he still has a decent score sheet of 3 goals, 6 assists for 9 points, which is important to remember. He did have multiple games this year in which he played with Goodrow and Kunin, not exactly the most offensively talented line. He's come up clutch for the Sharks multiple times with a couple of overtime goals for them, so that's very impressive as well. And so you do have to give some credit to Wennberg. Again, it's not going to be a great grade because he's not really anyone he's not really going to give you a performance that really blows you away, but he's been good enough, and as such he gets a B-. Then we move on to Barclay Goodrow. The expectations for Goodrow were right at the floor here coming into this season. There was not a lot that you were thinking you were going to get from this player, picked up off of waivers from the New York Rangers. The hopes were not particularly high, and yet Warsofsky has put him up and down the lineup constantly. We've seen him on the third line majority, but now recently he's been spending some time in the Sharks' top six, which you would have never hoped to see happen. However, you should note that you can't really fault Goodrow for this. This is more of a coaching decision, and unless he's giving some crazy ultimatum behind the scenes, he's just sort of playing and trying to stick to his own game. Having said that, though, the point totals do definitely leave a lot to be desired. You're not expecting a lot, but when you look at players like Cunnin and Sturm, who have spent a lot of the time in the bottom six, and they managed to have 5-6 points for themselves, and then you look at Goodrow, who has just 2 points and only one of them at even strength, even though he has spent time with Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini now thus far this season, that's a bit more of a disappointment. There were also many major issues defensively in the turnover situation near the beginning of the season that, while has been cleaned up, is not something that we can just easily forget. And so his grade, while not terrible, is also not very good, of a C-. Then we get to Sharks defenseman Jack Thompson. He only barely makes the cutoff here with 11 games played, but you do have to note that there is a lot of offensive talent with this player. 2 goals, 3 assists for 5 points. He's actually the highest goal-scoring defenseman on the Sharks, even though not only does he have a good bit less games played, but also a good bit less ice time as well. And so we can see that there is that element to his game that is very attractive for a team like the Sharks that really doesn't get much offense from their back end. Having said that, his season has not been without issue. There are games in which he is a bit of a defensive liability, though even more often than not, I would say he has been pretty good. Unfortunately here for him and with Warsofsky, we know he is a big fan of Jan Rutta, and as such, Rutta has kind of won out in a spot over Jack Thompson, so it feels as though he's only going to step in either when there's an egregious mistake being made and someone gets like a one-time healthy scratch, or if someone ends up getting injured and he's able to step into that role. So even though I think Thompson has been rather good and he has going to end up getting a decent grade of a B-, I wish we could see him more. Then we get to Mackenzie Blackwood, the first of the 2 San Jose Sharks goaltenders, and Blackwood, of course, has been one of the best players for the Sharks thus far this season. You can tell by his stats that the Sharks haven't necessarily done a great job in front of him. He's got a goals against average of over 3. He has only 4 wins in the 11 starts he's put up, but his save percentage is .911, which pretty much indicates that while he's giving up maybe slightly more goals than average, it's because he's facing so many more shots than usual. If you take a look at his goals saved above expected, it's actually one of the better ones in the entire league based on his ice time. I believe it's top 15 at the very least. And that, compared to most goaltenders who are usually sharing the crease, and so there's at least like 40 to 50 goalies involved in that, he is pretty securely in that upper half, and so he's given the Sharks a chance to win more often than not. There have been a couple of games where Blackwood has let in some of these weak goals. There are times where he does look a little bit out of it, so that's going to prevent him from having an absolutely amazing grade, but he still ends up as one of the best players here with an A-. Then we get to Mario Ferraro, and it's honestly somewhat tragic. You know, if Ferraro played with the San Jose Sharks, let's say 10 years ago when they were a competitive team with making the playoffs and everything, and you could have Ferraro play in like a third pairing role, I think he would have had a ton of success there. Give him 12 to 14 minutes a night, have him make hits, block shots, play in the playoffs. He's definitely built for that type of game, but instead we're in the present time where Ferraro is playing top 4 minutes, sometimes even top 2 minutes for the San Jose Sharks, and he's just not built for that. Even with the sort of willingness to sacrifice the body, the fact is that defensively his awareness on the ice is just not very good at all. And it's not just these kind of quiet mistakes that he makes occasionally, but it is the egregious standout errors that he constantly has in every single game that he plays. He is a turnover machine in his own zone, and so you cannot simply even justify giving him an even remotely good grade here, even if you do kind of commend the fact that he is willing to be that kind of heart and soul type of player for the San Jose Sharks. He still ends up with the grade pretty bad of a D. Then we get to Vitek Vanacek, the Sharks' other goaltender, and while he has also looked rather solid this season, his stats are a decent bit worse than Blackwood. He hasn't had those same amount of consistent clutch moments for the San Jose Sharks. There have been many games this season in which he hasn't been great, or even many games this season in which you've seen him play and you say, well, it's not his fault that the Sharks lost, but he just didn't really do much to help them win either. And so while I do think he's been better than average, it's still not great. So he ends up with the grade of a B-. Then we move on to Ty Dellandrea, brought in here by Mike Grier this past offseason in a trade with the Dallas Stars, brought in to be sort of a speedy, work hard, maybe chip in a bit offensively type of bottom six forward, and that's really the type of game that he has brought. I think he's maybe been slightly better than that. We saw recently over these last couple of games that he's managed to find some pretty good chemistry with Toffoli and Alex Wennberg on that third line, but otherwise it's been just kind of like a okay season thus far with Dellandrea. 1 goal, 3 assists for 4 points is decent but not great, especially since he has played with some pretty good players at times this year, at least as of late, and so he ends up with an okay grade of a C+. Then we move on to Mikael Granlund, and this might be a little bit controversial because when it comes to Mikael Granlund, you might think he's like an A+, absolute sweep, perfect performance, especially when you take a look at his point totals. 20 games played, 8 goals, 12 assists, 20 points. That is a point per game, on pace for 82. That much I could definitely understand, but I was leaning more in that direction in the first half of this current quarter. You know, when the Sharks were still at the tail end of that 9-game losing streak, Granlund was single-handedly trying to drag the Sharks across the finish line, and he actually managed to accomplish that in that comeback victory against the Utah Hockey Club, where the Sharks ended up ending that losing streak. But it feels as though he so much overexerted himself in that stretch of games that now, once the Sharks have gotten a bit better, while Granlund has still looked good, don't get me wrong, he's still one of the Sharks' better players, he hasn't really had that same level of dominance on the ice, which I'm fine with. You know, he is still playing a good game of hockey, but it is rare recently that we have had one that's just like, wow, Granlund, what a spectacular performance, and more often than not, it's, yeah, he played well, he's above average, it's looking good. And so his grade does suffer slightly from that, but it still ends up being very good at equal to what Blackwood got, an A-. Then we move on to Macklin Celebrini, and this one might also be a little bit controversial because with how exciting he has been on the ice, and especially coming off of the game yesterday where he got that overtime game winner, you might be thinking A+, done and dusted, easy one there for him. And while I have been a huge fan of Celebrini, it is quite clear on the ice that there is still some work to be done. He has shown off his incredible talent, his ability to carry pucks in the zone, his elite vision. He's got a great shot. There's a ton to love about this player, but like I said, some things to still work on for sure. His decision making with the puck when it comes to crossing the blue line, when he can hold on to it, when he should send it in, his actual the ability to get those passes through NHL defensemen also can be worked on. The idea is there, but sometimes the execution is not perfectly on the mark, which does lead to these turnovers. And there are still some problems in the defensive zone, though while he is much more advanced than most other 18-year-old forwards that come into the NHL, more advanced than the 19-year-old Will Smith as well, it doesn't mean that though everything is pristine and perfect for him, but still, with all of that being said, it is mostly positives here for Celebrini. He's been one of the Sharks' best players since he's returned from injury. He likely would have been very much in the Calder conversation if he was not injured for a large chunk of this season thus far, and so he ends up with a very solid B+. Then we get to William Eklund. As we know, Eklund has been one of the Sharks' best players, if not their best player over these last few games, but it wasn't always all that great for Eklund this season. Back at the beginning of the year, he had a bit of a slow start, not in terms of points, because he still ended up with, I believe, 4 goals, 11 assists, and 15 points, which puts him on pace for 60 to start this season. But with that being said here, when it comes to Eklund, like I said, that slow start, so it kind of balances out his grade a little bit. I have been a huge fan of Eklund. I've liked the steps forward that he has taken this season compared to last, and so he still gets a very good grade, but maybe just barely under the level of a Granlund or a Blackwood at a B+. Then we move on to Tyler Toffoli, and you know what? On the surface, stats-wise, you can't really be too disappointed with what he has done. 20 games played, 9 goals, 6 assists, 15 points, very solid point per game pace there for sure, and those 9 goals does lead the team, which is nice to see. The thing is that from an eye test perspective, Toffoli hasn't actually been all that impressive, and so it's this kind of weird dichotomy here where on the stat sheet he looks good, but actually playing he doesn't look that great, and that does shift his grade one way or the other. I think if he kept up a performance like a William Eklund or Mikael Granlund, he'd probably be up at least like an A-, but since there have been these not so great games where he just doesn't look super involved, super engaged, his defensive play is slightly better than okay, but is still not even remotely good, he ends up with the grade of a B-. Then we get to Jan Rutta, who will take off the mantle as the most underperforming player here relative to expectations on the San Jose Sharks. He has many of the same issues for Mario Ferraro, in which he is just not very good in the defensive zone, but the major difference there and why he ends up with a slightly lower grade is for the simple fact that while Ferraro does bring those hits and he brings those blocks and you could really tell that he's laying it all down on the line for the team, Rutta at times just doesn't look fully engaged into it. He looks a little bit confused and lost at times in the defensive zone as well. There's really not a lot of positives to say here. There have only been maybe 2 or 3 games this season in which Rutta has been slightly better than awful, except outside of that one game where he was paired with Jake Wallman, where Wallman looked so good that Rutta by comparison also looked pretty decent. But outside of those, he's usually just been a massive liability for the Sharks, and so he ends up with a D-. Then we get to Carl Grundstrom. You know, if you were just evaluating these last few games, Grundstrom would get a B+, maybe even an A-. He's been really good, but it's important to remember that near the beginning of the season, this was not the same Carl Grundstrom that we got. Not only was he just kind of invisible in a lot of those games, but on top of that, he was even a healthy scratch multiple times. 3 different healthy scratches thus far this season. He's only played 17 of the total 20 games for himself. And so while it does save him from having a bad score based on that start he had, it is still not maybe as good as it would have looked if he played this entire season like he did these last couple of weeks, and so he ends up with a B-. And then the final player on the board here, we do have Jake Wallman, definitely one of the most volatile players here. There have been tons of high highs in which Jake Wallman would be worthy of a grade of an A, and there have been many low lows in which Wallman would be barely deserving of even like the average C. And so it all kind of averages out here, where I think Wallman, there's a lot to like based on him as a player. He makes some great passes out of the zone. He can be quite good defensively. He has a very active stick. He can produce some decent offensive performances as well. The problem here is that when he is making these mistakes, they do look really, really bad. In a way, it kind of reminds you of Erik Karlsson, where Karlsson was so fantastic offensively, and yet he would just have these real issues from a defensive standpoint. Wallman does have that in his game as well, but still, I would say he's been the Sharks' best defenseman of the season. Coming into this, you weren't really sure what to expect considering of his unceremonious exit from the Detroit Red Wings this past offseason, but he still ends up with a pretty good grade of a B. But that would do it for this video. As you can see here, the grades are actually mostly solid. Even though the Sharks did start this quarter with 9 straight losses, that was obviously a very dark time of the season for the Sharks, 0-7-2 during that stretch. Over the last 11 games, which is just over half of this quarter, they have a record of 6-3-2. That is a good bit over 500. If they play that way moving forward, they might even find their way into the playoff conversation. It's not very likely to happen, obviously. It is very likely they'll sink back and indeed stay within the bottom 5-ish of the playoff of the standings. But we are seeing right now that it is perhaps very possible that the Sharks won't be last place by the end of this season. Class dismissed.